So, hi everyone, I'm Jay. So the reason is it's actually this event sold out, but we're still waiting for some people, and we're thinking about what makes people brave the weather to come to a literary event, and or not, or to kind of and I myself being also a literary programmer, I was telling Jay like sometimes I also get worried when the weather changes, and I always feel like, oh my God, there will be somebody or some people who won't take the extra effort that it needs to come to a literary event because of the rain. And so, I begin to think about it. What is it, because is it the fact that we think, for example, literature is more intimate, that we kind of, and when it rains, does it actually motivate that intimate part in us to kind of, I don't know, keep itself to itself and just be by itself and go into that literature and think to yourself, I've got Jay's work, I've got Sulaiman's book, I'm just gonna sit at home and read, Do you think, I don't know, that's how I feel, that kind of intimacy with literature and the call for isolation that makes some people more reluctant to brave the weather?
I mean, I don't know who these people are because when I buy tickets to things, I go to them, especially if it's live. I've done all kinds of crazy stuff to get to things. I don't understand this logic, but also I think you're right. Like when you said that, I immediately thought there's this thing called something cow, hip hop cow, or something like that on YouTube, and it's like this kid in her bedroom, and it's raining outside, and it's all this super chill hip hop, and I'm just that's perfect, right? So she's writing in her journal, she's got all these books around, she's just listening to all this chill beats, and it's pouring with rain outside, and I think there is something about that intimacy and that kind of closeness. Sometimes I just stare at the animation that just loops round and round and round. So yeah, but I feel like this is a very nice, intimate space. I was secretly pleased that we had to come inside, if I'm completely honest, because I like it when there's a boundary, a roof.
Can you tell me a bit about that? Because when you mentioned that to me, I was really interested by this idea of boundary itself, And I think, especially with my work, the notion of boundary is very, very important, and I'm sure with you as well. But yeah, I mean, I just was interested when you say, "Oh, I'm secretly pleased that we don't have to do the garden that we're here." I mean, I'd love to know. Yeah, a bit more about that.
I think I'm a massive cliche in that I'm one of those writers who was traumatized by playtime at school, because you had to go outside and there was just this endless expanse. There's all these children everywhere, and I was usually by myself, and I just didn't know what to do with that amount of space. All I really wanted was to stay inside the classroom and read. I didn't really want to. I didn't understand what playtime was for. You know what I mean? And I think that's probably carried with me my entire adult life. So if I can be cloistered or shut away, I'm really into that. For example, I'm the resident here right now, and it's great because there's no reason for me to leave the flat. I go down the stairs, there's a bookshop. I come up the stairs, it's a kitchen. I cook the food. Why do we need to leave? And it's great because of the pandemic as well. I mean, the pandemic is horrible, obviously. But I think there's maybe a few of us who are sort of somewhat relieved by the fact that we can do everything sort of, dressed from the waist up and from the waist down as pyjamas, that kind of thing. I think also there's something to do with how you present things. I always think a lot about the different technologies and media that we use, and how so much of it is acoustically designed for this kind of a space, and with the film and stuff like that. And I just maybe just like to have that level of control. You can control an indoor space.
I'd love to talk more about music and sound, because you mentioned the whole thing, but maybe a bit later, because I do feel for me, for example, music is just really important. Not that I listen during writing, but before writing, for example. And so I always say, like, I always wanted to write a novel that sounded like a song. There's, again, I think it's to do with boundaries, with me knowing, for example, initially when I came to London, I wanted to be a singer, And I actually took singing classes. I took singing classes, and then I was told I don't have it in me, which is fine. Actually, it's, and that was honest. In a choir, my voice does work, but not solo. But this idea of actually music or also poetry, which I love, but maybe we'll talk about that a bit more. Also about the fact that I can't write poems, but I can't write a book that is poetic. That I can't do. So there's this. I'm kind of the older I become, the more I think I become aware of my limitations as well as my strengths. And so, like, I think it's a sign of wisdom to actually. I always say sign of wisdom, not to say I never give up, but to know when you give up. There are things, for example, I wanted to do acting, for example, I gave it up because I thought, like, that's not for me. But so the music for me, it becomes almost like a vehicle or something like that kind of transport my prose to a certain place. How about you?
I mean, the first thing I want to say is that I think dwelling on our shortcomings could be like the central theme of this discussion, because I feel like it's something that we both have talked about like quite a lot. But then, like, what that really means, and what it means for like literature and for writing as well. For me, music is so crucial, but in ways that are maybe more scattergun and sort of vague, and I don't know if I can ever really pinpoint quite why I enjoy it, what I get from it, all the rest of it. Like, when I was growing up, all my friends were musicians. I learned to play like 7 instruments. Like, I've always had this like desire to be in a band, but have never been in a band because I don't play well with others mainly. And there's a kind of, maybe it's something to do with the collectivity versus the isolation of being like a writer. If I'm honest about it, I'm a solo, isolated, lonely ass writer, right? Like, but I aspire to be this like fun, cool, like, front person, like crooning into the mic and all the rest of it. So it's almost like the kind of the sort of like deluded ideas that you have of yourself, perhaps form a bedrock for what you then actually create, if that makes any sense. I mean, obviously I think it's a massive lie that you don't write poetically, because you do, but when we were talking a little bit about like, you tried to be a poet, I tried to write prose, there's got to be like a little bit of a grain in that still, right? Like, there's a grain of both in both of our work, Yeah.
I mean, I have a friend of mine who's a poet, and he's from Singapore. So he read my book and he told me, he wrote me saying, "Sulaiman, you're a poet," and I was like, okay, I love his poetry, and so for someone like him to say that, I thought like, oh my God, this is like one of the biggest compliment.
Was this Cyril Wong?
No, it's Alvin Pang. I don't know if you know Alvin Pang.
Totally,
Yeah. So that's Alvin Pang, and so he said that and really made me happy. It made me like, oh my God, this is amazing. Then I just have massive respect for poets, because I just feel like it's almost like you're given 2 pieces of furniture and you have to make the room work and look beautiful, and that kind of working with scarcity, with limitation, with the moment itself, with being in that kind of zone, with the kind of intense relationship that you have with those 2 pieces of furniture, it just seems to me incredibly emotional. It requires a lot of work. It requires a lot of depth. It requires a lot of emotion, which I think we writers also have. But I think it's also it's almost multiplied with poetry. So I don't know what to do with those two pieces of furniture. I might do, I might know, with more words, I might. It's just about this idea that I need more words to convey all the kind of feeling and thought that I have inside me. And that's what becomes prose, So I have a lot of massive respect for poet, the fact that they could work with so little to make something so big, sounds or, so big. Do you see what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. And yeah, I think it's super fascinating because for me it's like, I think at some point it becomes obvious what you do with those two planks of wood or whatever. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of, but it's not easy. Like when I first started out, I used to write sort of what I would call paraphrase poetry, where it was just basically prose, just chopped up. You just put you just in genre prose, and you call that poetry. That's not what it is really. It's actually more about the spaces and the arrangement. But it's also a kind of a vertical inquiry. And prose, as far as I understand, is a horizontal inquiry. This is Maya Deren, by the way. I sort of
never heard that before.
yeah, she was a filmmaker, and she tried to define the differences. So when you're writing a poem, you're not going across forwards in time. You're sort of kind of going downwards into the moment. So even if you span centuries, you know what I mean. Like there's something about a poem which is very much of this moment. It's a kind of invocation, kind of incantation, even. Which isn't easy, and it's not easy to explain either, and it's not very prevalent in popular culture anymore, and it's not something that we kind of look to for meaning in quite the same way as we used to. So I really understand that, but then I also think the fact that you sit and you write thousands and thousands and thousands of words, and they make sense, and it's all hanging together is also like kind of nuts to me. But I want to try it though.
What, to write?
Prose.
You should.
Yeah.
And I would try, but I've been trying. I was telling you actually when we had this discussion the other day, I've been trying for decades, and I think writing, to write poems, and it's just been, I wouldn't say failure, but it's just there's something in my head. I think I write poems, So I, again talking about rain and walking. I mean, in London, for example, when I used to walk in, and I would always write poems in my head. And when I come back home and I try to kind of, get that poem out of my head, it just doesn't happen. And it's just the kind of thing that has been going on for decades, So I wrote one poem, and then I thought, no, this is not a poem. You know what I mean? So for me, and then, I don't know if you know Khadija George, and she told me, Sulaiman, don't give up, keep trying, and keep trying. But I think, in a way, it works for me because that frustration is what really makes me the writer that I am, in a kind of the feeling that I have with words, for example, or the sentences when I write those sentences, the kind of, I think myself, I'm a poet writing prose, and for example, I would sleep 2 hours a night, and then I would be like in my room in the middle of the night reading poetry, and then I would have that kind of connection with words that maybe poets do, you know what I mean? So there's that kind of frustration and intensity that is very, very important to me. So maybe that's why, psychologically, I feel like I don't want to write a poem, You know what I mean? I don't know. Do you have that with prose? Do you think like, okay, or you've like determined you're going to write prose now?
Do you know what I think it is? I think it's like I'm saving it for when I feel like I'm worthy. You know what I mean? Like I think there's something about like, maybe because it's so easy to publish things now because you can just kind of put stuff on the internet. But I do remember making a pledge that I would never publish any prose until I really felt like I would take it seriously and like really do it. And maybe for me, poetry has been the way of like developing as a writer, and thinking about things. Like it's become the like, not the prism, but and not the lens even, but the jacket that I wear, you know what I mean? And that through which I've kind of developed a sort of identity or a kind of way of moving through the world. And I think there's something really important about not doing everything, you know? Yeah. There's something important about not putting everything into the public domain, keeping some things back until such a time as you've, at least for yourself anyway, gained a sort of mastery or a sort of, and then mastery is a whole other like area, do you know what I mean? But a sort of like, I can shake hands with myself and be like, yeah, you've met your own standard. You're not bullshitting right now. You know what I mean? Like I've done a lot of bullshit in my life, like random projects and crappy shit that I've put out. You know what I mean? And it's like, I don't want that to be the case if I move into a new form. Essays, yeah, like that's different. But like fiction, and maybe it's because I grew up reading fiction, and fiction was my first love. And when Toni Morrison died, I literally like cried my eyes out in a way that I didn't even expect. You know what I mean? Like, it's, yeah, I want to do it justice, you know? And so maybe that will come.
Yeah. I think it's more like it becomes, or it turns into fuel that kind of energize whatever kind of medium you choose to exercise, you know? But I want to talk a bit more, about relationship with writing itself in relation to a place. Because, I actually, when I came to the UK, I felt a Londoner before I felt British. And that's the kind of place for me. That's the kind of place that energized my creativity, if you see what I mean. Like, and I feel like, so for us two Londoners to be in conversation here in Brussels, quite amazing, but also it opens up itself to a lot of questions around not only identity, but also the whole kind of, like I said, your relationship, to a place. Do you need, for example, to the need to belong to a particular place to get a text done, for example? Or like, or do you feel like a sense of loss? Like I always feel like I need to feel lost for me to find myself in my writing. You know what I mean? So there's the two kind. From the relationship I have with place is very ambiguous. Mm-hmm. You're British Londoner. I'm someone who came to the UK when I was 15. So I just wanted to know your relationship with London, because I know your archive. I know we actually lived in London in the same
places.
In the same places,
like exactly the same places.
Exactly, and in Croydon, New Cross, also King's Cross and stuff like that. So I just wanted to know, and that kind of relationship you have with London and how it works itself in your taste.
I think for me it's absolutely crucial. I didn't know how crucial it was, and with everything that's going on politically now, I'm really torn, because I think my understanding of myself, the place that I occupied, was quite broad. I spent time in France when I was a teenager. I spent time in Berlin. I tried to move to Berlin once. It didn't go well. I got kicked out of my flat while I wasn't there. It was really weird. They just sent me an email being like, come and pick up your stuff. I was like, okay, weird. But yeah, I had a kind of like European sense of myself, and that in some ways complemented the London sense of myself, and in some ways that allowed for an English sense of myself as well, because I do feel English. Like I do feel like I feel like it's disingenuous for me to say that I'm not, because I really, really am. And like when I go to like the north or like Scotland or other places, I'm like, you are definitely English. Like it's just, it's embarrassing actually. Do you know what I mean? So like, I think all of those things in combination have allowed for a very like Jenga style construction of like who I am, how I relate to the rest of the world. And with the European part being kind of like taken away now, that just leaves London, England, and Britain, and Jamaica to an extent, but less so.
What do you mean taken away?
Well, because I'm not a citizen here anymore.
But do you feel you need that kind of citizenship?
Yes.
You do?
Yeah, I feel like it's really, really, really important. Yeah, I feel like that's absolutely crucial, because you can have something in theory, but if it was in theory, then we wouldn't have needed to leave the European Union. You know what I mean? It had to be made concrete. You had to remove that right to freedom of movement in order to implement whatever other, political plans you have. So for me, as a writer, like I came here in November for Black History Month, and we were doing, you know what I mean? Like that is for me like absolutely 100% crucial, and it's crucial for me to be able to get on a train and come through immigration and be like, hello, I'm a citizen, I have an absolute right to be here, because people that look like me don't often have that privilege, right? But also I think there's something really intense about the fact that what's happened now, which I don't think gets talked about enough, is the fact that you have a whole generation of Black British people who are going to be cut off from the continent now. So there's going to be this sort of this kind of sort of splice in history. I was allowed to kind of come here. I could have set up a life here, do you know what I mean? But now there's going to be a whole generation of Black British kids who just don't have that right. It's not like they're not going to be able to think about it in the same way. They're not going to be able to just be like, oh yeah, I'm going to do an Erasmus course, or oh yeah, I'm just going to move to France, or oh yeah, do you know what I mean? And I think that's actually really, really crucial for people. Yeah. But you must know this because, someone who you arrived in London without, as far as I understand, without that kind of surety, that certainty, right? And then eventually you had to get it, and now you've been able to kind of move around the world. I think it's actually hard to overstate how important that little book is, that little bit of paper is.
No, I definitely do. I mean, I remember when I lived in a camp, for example, when we were leaving the camp, Sudan, to go to Saudi Arabia, for example, we had a passport that said, for people without a country, So, there's that sense of actually, so I come from that background where I know exactly what a piece of paper like the one you mentioned means to human beings like us, But also I think what it made me question is this notion of identity and belonging, So I've always been sort of, on the outside, or, like even coming to the UK, for example, not, like I said, not feeling quite British, not feeling here, or not feeling Ethiopian, or not feeling Eritrean or Sudanese or Saudi Arabia, or coming here, I'm not Belgian, what I mean? So I've always lived in a kind of a zone that wasn't mine by nature, And I remember Taib Saleh's novel, one of my first influences as a novelist, The Season of Migration to the North, Sudanese novelist. He actually wrote it in London. And in it, he talks about belonging and him coming back, for example, from London, where he was exoticized, going back to Sudan, for example, where he felt at home. And I've always wanted, my writing is between the two, between this idea of London, where you don't feel you belong, and back home, when there's no place for you to go back home, So, it almost feels like I've made peace with myself, with this idea that, I really don't feel I belong anywhere except silence, With this idea where I feel immensely me when I'm alone, intensely in a relationship with myself. And I feel that intensity generates itself in my work, and I really crave that intensity, and I guard that intensity. And that's why sometimes I've got 2 kids, for example, and sometimes, I go to bed really late, and I wake up really early, just to have that thing when I'm not a dad, or I'm not this, or I'm not anything except me and silence and my books, and you know what I mean. So for me, it feels like I might come to the UK or I might be here. I've just accepted that there's a sense of this kind of no relationship to any place or fully. I don't know if I'm making sense, but this kind of full relationship of belonging to a place. Like you say, I feel English, and you are English. You know what I mean? I can't say that. You know?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I think that's why I think it's disingenuous for me to say otherwise, because, you know, reading your book, reading the works of other people who have been displaced or don't have a country or and all of that sort of thing, I'm like, well, I mean, it's really easy to identify with that. It's really easy to be like, oh, because of the colonial history or whatever, I don't identify with this, or it's not where I'm from. But if you have the privileges of having that magenta passport, I personally think there's a lot of questions that you need to be asking yourself, because I simply don't have your experience. I have an experience of being a citizen of a particular place and reaping the benefits of being a citizen there. You know, like one of my oldest writing friends is Inua Ellams, right? And Inua was a really great poet, and you should totally check him out. But it took him 22 years before he got his passport, which was only maybe a year or two ago. And so in all the time that I was going to university, like I was traveling around and all that stuff, he couldn't leave the UK. He couldn't go to university. So he had to invent like his whole brand and like be self-employed and kind of do all of this stuff just to kind of like live. And it's been incredibly successful for him. But just because we might be on the same stage, or we might be spoken about in the same breath as like black British writers, his experience is not mine. And I think it's really problematic when people assume his experience or like want to side with that without actually examining. I just don't have that experience. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah.
I think you touched on something which really interests me, which is the diversity within the black diaspora and also black writers. You know, it's, you know, sometimes they, you know, it's really, for me it's like really important to actually pay attention to that, because you know, you can say, for example, you have a panel, and then you have two black writers on a panel like us here today, and then people will say, oh, we had two black writers, you know, and that's, but then again, most of the time those two black writers tend to be the same, straight or this, you know what I mean? So, and because the kind of complexities are lost on people who actually create those kind of events, you know. And you know, it's only recently that a lot of people started paying attention to that, which I think is very, very important. That I don't, you know, no other black person will speak for me, you know, because I have a personal experience, like you two as well, you know. I can't speak for you, you know. But we are expected to kind of, you know what I mean.
Fascinating.
And so, like, you know, I always feel like, you know, if you want to hear about my experience, then treat me as an individual. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm always careful, you know. Again, you know, someone said to me, do you label yourself a black writer or this writer or that? You know, I insist calling myself a writer, you know. And that's nothing to do with me being outside my, you know, my race or my sexuality or my religion or whatever. It just feels like I said, like, I have to have the same privilege as somebody, as Martin Amis or somebody else who has that privilege of being called a writer, even though if you compare our lives are totally different, right? Because I feel I earned the right to call myself a writer, because you know, that's what we do. We spend years and years, you know, sweating, poor, hungry, you know, sexless and whatever, you know, and you know, to kind of complete a work, and then you get kind of pigeonhole of, you know. Does it annoy you? I mean, I know this is...
You know, I love that, sexless and hungry. Yeah. I'm getting... maybe my new bio. I love that. It's really great that you mentioned speaking for others, because I was reading a whole essay on this very, very thing. I often get invited to things where I think people expect me to say a certain thing, and it's not that I don't want to say it, but it might just be that I don't believe it or that maybe I do believe it, but I have like a certain different angle on it or whatever. But then it also like brings up this other like area. So because my work so far, like with my first collection, has been so much about the new Crossfire, and also like Grenfell as well. There's a kind of thing of like, oh, you can invite the writer, and then the writer can speak on behalf of the community. In inverted commas, and I'm kind of like, I really don't think that this queer, trans, Oxford-educated loner like speaks for all of Kensington.
Yeah.
I think it's a bit weird for you to like assume that, but also it's kind of weird for you to assume that. I don't know, like, do you know what I mean? Like, just all of the assumptions are really weird. But then I was like reading this essay, which is really awesome, by the way. It's called "The Problem of Speaking for Others," and she just makes this really.
Sorry, who's the writer?
Linda Alcoff. And she just like, the whole thing is like looking at this like problem, right? Because you're called upon, because there's a particular issue or so on, but you might have like differing opinions or whatever. And then she kind of like really breaks down what truth is, and how its different manifestations call for different solutions, right? It seems really obvious. But I really like this bit where she says, I won't read the whole thing, obviously, but she says, I kind of want to read the whole thing. Okay, right. She talks a little bit about how sometimes avoiding speaking for others can be a way of avoiding criticism and so on. But then she also says that like actually we shouldn't try to avoid those mistakes either, right? And so she says the pursuit of an absolute means to avoid making errors comes perhaps not from a desire to advance collective goals, but a desire for personal mastery, to establish a privileged discursive position wherein one cannot be undermined or challenged, and thus is master of the situation. I thought that was really very interesting way of kind of understanding it. So she says, like, from such a position, one's own location and positionality would not require constant interrogation and critical reflection. One would not have to constantly engage in this emotionally troublesome endeavour and would be immune from the interrogation of others. Such a desire for mastery and immunity must be resisted. And I kind of think that works both ways, right? It works both in the kind of thing of like, I'm not going to speak for anyone, I can only speak for myself. But I think it also works in the kind of like, as a queer person, like, you can shut down arguments either way, if that makes any sense. Yeah, so I think it's kind of important to sort of like be aware of that, and to be aware of that tendency towards mastery.
Yeah. But the whole idea of you, or if you being on a stage, and I think it's important as far as representation is concerned, but that's for people watching, or like, for example, my daughter. I mean, I remember my kid, for example, when my son, when he was watching this program, in the Dutch-speaking channel, there was one black girl, a black woman, a young black woman, and then she committed suicide in real life. And so, you know what I mean? So the entire cast was white, and then there was one black woman who committed suicide. Mm-hmm. And so he was trying to talk, and I kind of, his mother was kind of doing the whole conversation with him. But for me, it was extremely difficult to kind of have that conversation for somebody who saw one person representing him, maybe, and then that person was gone, And so this idea of presence, and, through actually seeing somebody who looks like you on a stage, and then there's an idea of you being present on a stage, What I'm trying to say is representation is incredibly important, but also representing yourself and your traumas and your pain is also important, because we don't know what this woman was going through. The fact that she probably is, because she was the only black woman in the thing, she was, the kind of burden on her shoulder, you know what I mean? And so, I worry about that. I worry about the kind of burden we have on writers and celebrities and actors and black, because sometimes we ask them to do so much and more. I mean, if again, if you white and black, for example, a black writer, you are expected to talk more about the politics, about this, about that. But as a white writer, maybe you don't ask that burden, and I've always been kind of, how do I isolate myself from that burden in order to create the literature that I want to create, and I think that's when we sort of mention about the responsibilities. So I'd love to know what you think, because I know your search, for example, is rooted on the archive and actual fact that happened in New Cross. So I just would love to hear your thoughts around
it's sort of one of those unending conversations, isn't it?
We always have it,
always, and I think it's always going to happen as long as you have I don't think you can have like truthful conversations in a dishonest context, right? Like, unless there's going to be, everybody is going to be thinking about how they operate and their own power and everything, then that kind of depiction is always going to be harmful, because you could be like, oh, it's true. Yeah, but it's true, but it's also on screen. So actually I think truth takes on a whole other like meaning when something is put on a screen, same when something is put on a stage and so on. But it's something, like something we've been talking about for like 100 years, and I don't think we're ever going to get to the end of it unless we change context. You know what I mean? Like people, friends of mine who come from like Nigeria or Ghana, Jamaica, they're like, we don't have this problem, because they're not in a racially mixed context. So it doesn't. I think it's something unique to us, because here we are. But if I could just bring Toni Morrison into the conversation, God rest her soul. Right? I know, right? But what you're saying about and then I think maybe we should show some stuff, right? Should we show some stuff afterwards? Yeah. Okay. I won't go on too long then. But in Playing in the Dark, which is her essay, a sort of theoretical essay on how blackness has been used in literature, she looks at a whole range of literature over about 100 years or something like that. But at the very beginning, which is ironically titled Black Matters, she says, I want to draw a map, so to speak, of a critical geography and use that map to open as much space for discovery, intellectual adventure and close exploration as did the original charting of the New World without the mandate for conquest. I intend to outline an attractive, fruitful and provocative critical project, unencumbered by dreams of subversion or rallying gestures at fortress walls. So I'll just leave that there.
Well, tell me your reaction to that text when you read something like that. What's,
I just think hallelujah, I think that's why I really love her work. And I feel very kind of inspired by it as well, because this idea of, I don't know if you saw the documentary, there's a whole documentary about her work called The Pieces That I Am, and in it she says, she was working, she was publishing Angela Davis, right? We're talking about abolition today. She was the one who was like doing that, like on the ground, but nonetheless in her own work, she was like, well, these people out on the streets, that's great, but I can write, that's what I can do as an individual. And so what you're saying about you as this island, as this house floating in the ocean, and that your silence in your isolation is really crucial and important. I think she literally writes that, you know what I mean? She wrote this 30 years ago almost. So I think it's super important, but also it's such a relief. I think I really tread that boundary between the political and the artistic and all of that, and I think the archive allows me to temper that. If you know what I mean, but nonetheless, I just love that there is this quotation that I can return to over and over again, where she's like, provocative, critical, fruitful. That's no less radical, if you ask me.
Just before we go to the video, I just want to say I was in Lagos last year at Ake Festival, and we had this conversation around, for example, responsibility, which we have it everywhere we go, and that's one of the problems, like say, it will never go away, right? But for me, for example, when I decided to write Silence, for example, it's set in a refugee camp, and obviously it calls for a cliche. It's immediately you think like, oh my God, it's gonna be about refugees, blah 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 blah. But I sort of felt like, all right, those African, Eritrean, Ethiopian refugees, wherever they go, they also live, right? And so I'm interested in that kind of small, simple details of a black person who happened to be displaced, the whole notion of sexuality, even though they displaced, maybe they don't have enough food, or they have question of belonging, or war and trauma, but also there's, you have sex anywhere you go, or you think about love, or you think about your sexuality, who you are, what you are, your sexual identity. And I felt like my work deals with this kind of intimate interrogation of a person, happened to be black, and I always felt like in most of literature we are, expected to kind of deal with the big kind of epic, colonialism, politics and stuff. But what I feel is the intimate can also be an epic, and that's the kind of thing I think. I don't, I have friends who write about politics and I love their work, who write about war, or, I love their stuff as well. But also we have to give the space, to write what you really want, and I sometimes feel like we black artists, sorry to black writers, African, whatever, we don't give each other that space, We are each other's worst critic. We would say, for example, I had, WhatsApp conversation and I lost friendship over this idea, like but you're black, you have to write about, and those are black writers who were telling me this, the fact that you are writing, you are political just because you're black. Sure, you can call it that, but at the end of the day, I am what I am. I'm a writer and I write about those things I want. So it just feels to me there's that kind of tension that we somehow expect from each other to be something in particular. Do you get me? Or, I mean, do you?
Yeah. I think it's also all marginal people, Seamus Heaney, Irish, wrote a whole poem about it, where one of the lines is, when will you write something for us? They say, and he's like, if I write anything, it'll be for myself. And he is emblematic, Irish writer. People have ideas about this stuff. I think they always will. I try not to worry too much about it, but nonetheless also acknowledge the kernel of truth in perhaps what they say. With Surge, why did I feel compelled to write about the new Crossfire? Well, partly because nobody had written about it in poetry. Well, no one had done a whole collection around it. There were definitely like single poems here and there, but there was something about undertaking the responsibility of putting something on the shelf that someone could then take down again that felt crucial. And I only got that that impulse because of the political conversations, or the political kind of like, but the book itself is, I would say, a mishmash. You know what I mean? It's like the personal and the private is at the core of it. I'm not making grand statements about any kind of ideological future, and I think that's kind of all you can say personally, especially with something that's kind of past and that I wasn't even alive to witness. You know what I mean? So the political element, I think, can be channeled into the, what's the word, the production, the publication, all of that like other stuff, I don't think it has to be the text, solely the text.
Could you tell me, I read your poem and I just wanted to, first of all, know the creative process that went behind it, clearing, I think it was.
Oh, okay.
I love that.
You know what? I actually think it would be better to talk about that after the film.
After the
because
film, okay.
the film does...
Because I'd love to know how it came about and the whole... Because it's one of the things why I'm so scared of... Like, I have huge respect for... Yeah. And I'd love to know, yeah.
Yeah, totally. But I think it makes sense, actually, to watch this. If we can turn the lights off.
with those 13 dead, murdered at 439 New Cross Road on the 18th of January.
I'd like to set the scene. Nearly 40 years ago, there was a girl, and it was her 16th birthday, and there was a fire, and she perished. And I read about that girl and the violence at the center of her story. You might say this is a letter to Yvonne Ruddock, and that the scene is New Cross, January 18th, 1981. It is the morning, cold and early in the history we are about to witness. There's a girl, and there are her friends, and there's a party, and there are candles, and rum, and coke, and a banging sound system, and boys toasting and cracking jokes over the mic. And there is England, stretched out in its frosty bed, dark as a lidded eye. And there's the girl, 16, coming into her body that listens and moves to the music. The sound systems back then were sentinels in the dark, hailing the black sky creaking with light. She knew herself to be a girl, and she believed she'd grow into a woman. But something else happened.
This is an area that has experienced a number of racist attacks. A mass movement has developed. Had the military incidents around this festival, police inaction, and equally over so many murders of blacks in the country. Attacks and this is one area where we said the buck has to stop. In spite of that, we had the suppression of the information concerning the firebombing. Those are the tactics we know the police use. Those 13 which are really tactics to prevent us, the people, from showing the extent of our indignation, the extent of our solidarity with those 13 dead. A mass movement has developed in the country around this question of the police inaction over so many murders of blacks in the country. And this is one where we said the buck has to stop.
There is a stillness at the center of the story. In a dark room, on a winter's night, something happened that no one will ever know. The London you knew has disappeared forever. You'd be a grown woman by now. You're not much younger than my mother. You shared this earth with my grandmother. Maybe you met eyes in the street, stood near each other at a market stall. I spent weeks in the archives, imagining how you went about the world, reading through the interviews, listening to the tapes, trying to piece together a picture of who you were and what you came to represent. The fire that night was a moment of transformation. It was part of the creation story of where we are today. I would not be who I am without it, and yet I feel a strange discomfort writing to you. My own historical moment feels like an echo of yours. It haunts me, informs me, has become the subtle harmonic in my thinking and my speech. The climate in this country is shifting. It looks and feels like the past, and the more I read about you, about the fire, the more my body becomes attuned. The more this history feels like a damaged bone in my body, able to tell the weather, aching in anticipation of a coming storm. After the fire, there was a protest through the streets. Crowds chanted, 13 dead, nothing said. But that is no longer true. We will continue to say something new, something in memory of you. They wanted you out, Yvonne, but now I can't help but think that they want to keep some of us in. We're entering a new age of isolationism. My fear is not that I will be kicked out, but that I will not make it out. That the body I am coming to inhabit is too aberrant, too strange, too violently altered. I am already marked as different. To be racialized is always to be different, to be shackled to another time and place, to be a ghost. But in a few short weeks, I will have changed again. I will have gained 2 long scars across my chest. And when I am laid out on the mortician's table, everyone looking will know that I chose ambiguity, complicated my already fraught relationship with the state, with history. My chest as a refutation, permanent in my skin. Still, I carry you deep inside me, and I can never disavow the little black girl I was, the black women who dreamed me into existence. What does it mean to alter my female body, to masculinize, when I know the history of black women in this country, when I know how painful it has been? My body shifts, and I must say goodbye to it as it once was. I write over it with scars, the story of what might have been. What might have been. I often lie there, thinking about it.
So yeah, I think it maybe puts it in a slightly different context, you know, and is maybe a demonstration of what I mean when I try and say that I try to address political or like events in history, but through the personal and the private, in very intimate ways. Yeah.
I saw one of your conversation, I can't remember with who it was, on YouTube, and you talk about the city being embedded. Did it lead to this? I mean, to the fact that you have a relationship with the city, its politics, history, that is embedded in you as a person, and then it kind of, you know, you feel that kind of relationship between the place and the history of the place?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a very specific history that I'm talking about, right? I mean, we both know literally like the road that fire happened on, right, in New Cross. It's like a big, massive stretch, and it's like this one little house that is so much smaller than you think it's going to be, and that, like, it's such a specific and local bit of history in a funny way. Do you know what I mean? But as a card-carrying South Londoner, it's kind of what makes me. Do you know what I mean? Like, that area of London is me. I don't know where else I would come from, really. Do you know what I mean? And like the more if I talk more about my life and my education and my background and the patterns of movement and so on, it's South London. It's this tiny speck on a map. But then there's something about the specificity that allows you to then speak generally, right? That's a cliche almost. And I personally long for more stories that look at that specificity and combine it in interesting ways. Like I'm a film programmer at the BFI, so I watch 500 films, and the ones that are most interesting to me are the ones that are like, let me like really dig deep into this. Let me like. I don't like generalities. I don't like generalizations. You know what I'm saying? I don't like ideologies. Do you know what I mean? I like things that are like specific and where we can like turn it in the light. You know. And so the films that I'm always like looking for and hungering for are films that do that. You know, that it's like this is a person from Bideford. No one's ever heard of Bideford, right? But I'm going to tell this story. You know.
You know, in the film you spoke about choosing ambiguity, and that really struck me, because by and large people like clarity. You know, this is the idea that you get writers, whether be it women or writers of color, to clarify things for you. You know, because you always you don't know your relationship, or you have a kind of you're worried about ambiguities, about you kind of say, I chose it, you know. Could you just, because I'm really interested, you know, and how that does for what it does for your work. I mean, I'm sure there's the personal side, but also the artistic.
I mean, you chose Clearing of all the poems, right? And Clearing is probably the poem that is the most about, not necessarily ambiguity, but existing in several locations at once, right? In fact, maybe I should just read it so everyone knows we're all on the same page. And it's a poem that came directly out of like working in the archives and reading some of the stories about what the police or firefight. Is it the police? I don't know. The people who kind of go into the building after the fire has happened, and some of the things that they found, and they were like, there were 8 bodies in there, and sort of, you know, in various stages of, you know, decomposition, basically. And also with Grenfell, there was all these reports of when we went up to the top floors that people had just kind of carbonated, like completely, that there was actually just nothing left, really. And I found that a dark and macabre, but nonetheless powerful metaphor for life, actually, in a funny way. Like, I don't feel like I occupy one thing, and I feel like I see things from many different points of view as well. And I think there was something about like inhabiting that. So anyway, it's called Clearing. He takes my head and places it in a plastic bag. Downstairs, 2 officers stamp their feet, blow into their hands. The windows are cups of water filled with winter. He holds the bag open, searching for a gaze to meet. Cold thirsts at the bones. He doesn't see me standing there. He doesn't hear me speak. An officer circles the front yard, leaning back to see the smoke. Or is it steam? Is it fire or water that can bring a child back? Elide that which is heavy in his hand, and that which watches from the corner of the room. This house is a gas lamp. Soot frosts its glass white gut. The officer closes his eyes. 2 blank pennies in a fount. From the bag, I watch his face turn away, and from the corner, his body bending towards mine. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, the language really struck me, you know. I mean, we were talking about the language, about, you know, the fact that we, you know, the fact that you said, oh, you wanted to kind of learn a different language. And I think, to me, that kind of, it just reminded me of this whole notion of languages. And then I said to him, I did a paper on what was it? When I say to you, Jay, paper on multilingualism and the fact that I said to Jay, the fact that we call ourselves multilingual almost as a kind of a celebration to say, oh, I learned this language, that language, this language, you know, oh, I must be good. But for me, because of the history I have with languages, multilingualism also means multi-trauma, multi-wound, you know, to say I'm multilingual is to say I'm multi-wounded, you know. I just, you know, and it's just this idea to me that a language, and I don't know if you feel the same when you write, whether is is it, for example, is poetry an actively learned language? Is it a different language to say, I know it's in English, it's your mother tongue, but do you actually, when you go from speaking it to writing it, does it become a different language? Because, in the same way as you would say, I'm going from, like me coming from the UK here, and I didn't know whether to learn Dutch or French. I was so confused. I'm still confused. This idea of, and that's ambiguity. This kind of notion of not knowing which language you go for, or which language you write in. I write in English, but sometimes I feel I don't have a mother tongue. Because I have such an ambiguous relationship with language. Do you have the same? Or?
Yeah, I'm literally writing a whole essay on this right now. To address the first question of like whether poetry is another language, I think it's another way of approaching language for sure, and I think there's ways of reading it. I think it's a different way of reading, I think often people approach poetry as though it's information. So, they're going to begin at the top of the poem, and they're going to get information about the new Crossfire, and then they're going to know what it is and what happened. And that's just not how it works, And I won't go into like all of the different like reading techniques there are, but there are many, you know what I mean? There's different approaches to different authors even. You've got to bring in the historical, you're bringing in the biographical, you're bringing in the fact that they belong to this movement or that movement or whatever, what they were against, there's all kinds of stuff that you bring into reading. So for me, it's like when I write a poem like that, for example, I'm thinking both, how do I get this language as succinct as possible? How do I get across the idea of something happening in two places at once without there being any grammatical confusion? How do I perform this poem? Because actually, to be honest with you, I usually will just stand up and do it, and usually I deliver it over my shoulder. You know what I mean? Because it's part of a performance. So there's all this other stuff that comes with language, and I think that really chimes with the fact that when people say that communication is 80% non-verbal or something like this, that really makes sense with poetry as well. I think so much of what you're getting from it isn't the word black and then the meaning of the word black. It's that in relation to the space and the enjambment and the line break and, you know what I mean, all this other stuff, where it sits in a metaphor. And I think learning those reading practices is maybe more crucial. And then in terms of language, I call myself monolingual, but that's complicated as well. Do you know what I mean? I speak English, but I also speak and understand patois. And I don't know if I really believe that's another language. You know what I mean? It's this real gripe I have. And lots of people disagree with me. They'll be like, no. And I watch all these YouTube videos of people trying to teach people how to speak Jamaican patois. You should check it out. It's really fascinating. And they just can't do it. They don't know what's being said. They can't pronounce it. They don't know how to do the actions that go with it. And I'm like, wow, man, this really is another language. And yet, maybe it's because it sounds to me like English. I understand every word you're saying, and it's in English as far as I'm concerned. That I struggle with that mental thing, but I think that's also a product of my education, right? I did a very specific English course, that had very clear boundaries around it. So of course I've got that attitude, right? But then again, like you say, it's also born out of a kind of Toni Morrison calls it natal isolation, which I just think is the best phrase. It hits the nail on the head, right? Natal isolation is this thing of I don't come from Jamaica, right? When I go to Jamaica, it's really obvious that I'm not from there, you know what I mean? And it's really hard to embody the language. I feel like a fraud. I genuinely do. You know what I mean? But then I'll write a poem that uses Jamaican patois. So it's this thing, and I think you're right, this idea of multilingualism is something good and a sort of a medal that you pin to your chest is really problematic. But then again, I think there's also something super problematic about coming from one of the most powerful countries in the world and speaking the language of supremacy and domination and never stepping outside of that. Do you know what I mean? So when you talk about multi-wounded, I'm also kind of interested in what your journey was towards learning English and towards which one did you learn, French or Dutch?
Neither.
Let's not go there. But with English, actually, so I came to London, I think 1990, I think it was, and maybe I spoke like hello, hi, and things like that. And then I remember, for example, my English teacher, they called it, so we took this course called English for Speakers of Other Languages, and so I remember she said, you have to read newspaper so you could speed up the process of learning, and my brother and I came with the Sun. We didn't know what it was, and she binned it straight away, and it was funny because the Sun, I don't know, I'm sure most of you know what the Sun is.
Trash.
Yeah. And she recommended The Guardian. And so I remember actually, so with dictionary and, not being able to even understand the title of the article or the headline of the article, So you just, so you're translating word by word, and it's really gruesome exercise, And so I remember and she always said, oh, I have no idea English obsession was 5, She said 5 words a day. They would say 5 pieces of fruit a day. I have no idea, where this obsession with 5 comes from. But that's what she said. 5 words a day would do. So this is what happens. So that's my relationship with English started like that. So from the headlines, the first sentence, then go to the first paragraph. And so, and then being able to kind of read The Guardian from the front to the back, and that's took years, of patience, and that's why I have intense relationship with English itself, as a language of writing, because, you kind of, it's not natural, you're not born with it, or born into it, so you kind of acquire it, and I acquire it through hard work, and through also the process that the more you acquire it, you're given more of the languages that you carried with you to that language. And so that's what the two meet, the gain and the loss. And that's for me where the trauma happens, And so my relationship, so I'm really quite, for me it's an achievement actually to come around and write in English in the way I do. But also I always say to myself, I carry that kind of trauma, the fear of losing, because I lost all my mother tongues that I learned, like Arabic and Tigrinya, and also in order to give language a space in my body, And when you talked about the city or, being part of you rather than the other way around, we always think we human beings are part of the city, I am part of Brussels, but sometimes, Brussels can also inject Brussels into you. And that's what happens with languages, you inject it into you. And with all its meaning, with all its wounds, with all its sexiness, and so, when I came here, for example, I came with that fear, and it took me a long time to actually say to myself, right, I can learn a different language, because I was so scared of losing English, as I've lost my other languages as well. Well, I still speak them, but really weakly. And so that's what I'm talking, that the kind of, and now recently I've been kind of, during the lockdown, for example, I took up French, and it, it's really improving, because I want to write in French one day. That's the mission I have for myself, because one of my favorite writers, Samuel Beckett, did it, so I feel like, right, maybe one day I could also do it like him. So do you think you will learn a language and maybe write in French or in German?
Well, I've been on Duolingo since I got here, trying to learn French.
Yeah.
The thing about it is I'm fluent in the flat, but when I leave the apartment, something strange happens. I could do all kinds of description, but I think it's something about the kind of I think that's a really. Yeah, again, a really beautiful and insightful way of describing it. I can't imagine what it would be like to lose English.
I don't know who I would be. I don't know what that would mean, and maybe I'm too old for that ever to really happen. But I think you started learning when you were like a teenager, so that's kind of a possibility. But also, I think you were entering into a dominant language, right? The language of colonialism, the language of domination. So I know how English speakers think about people like you, right? Which is pretty badly, and people get really annoyed and really and think you're really stupid, And there's something about that then means we're more reluctant to then learn anything because we have this horrible idea of what people sound like. Like I'm always really worried that like I remember this. No, I'm not gonna repeat that. But like I just.
We're talking about where do you learn? Some people learn languages because of love, because of intimacy, because of desire, because of and in the way you describe it, there was kind of an intense relationship with this idea like someone can understand you, but you can't understand them. But also I was reading some of your poems, and and there's a kind of I don't know if you have time, but I just wanted to know about the wound of a sentence, or the kind of desire that one sentence can carry, or the kind of how much weight can you give to one line of a poem. I really wanted to know that.
Oh, I don't know if I can tell you because that's a really intense question. How much can you... Because on the one hand, it can be like, how much can you expect one poem to do? Mm-hmm. And certainly I do have a tendency to overwrite. Like, I do have a tendency to want... And I mean that in a personal practice. Like, I want one poem to be a theory of everything and to say everything that could ever be said by literature. You know what I'm saying? Like, and that's impossible and crazy. But then again, in the work and in poetry... Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think I have an answer as such, but I want to throw that right back at you. Yeah. In prose, how much is contained in a sentence? Because there's so many of them, you might think that the meaning might be somewhat dispersed, but do you construct it in that way, like sentence by sentence? Like, is each one loaded for you?
It's... When I asked you, I thought, I expected your answer because I would give you the same answer. Yeah. I don't know if you follow Formula One, for example. So Lewis Hamilton from the UK, he's he did this amazing lap last Saturday in qualifying. It was raining and he was 1 second point 2 ahead of everybody else. And it's a huge difference. And so they asked him like, how did you do it? And so he said exactly what you said. I don't know, it just happened, And so the reason I ask you is because I want to learn from you as a poet and how much to give weight. Because for me, weight is important, in a kind of, especially if you want to get consistency across a book like fiction, for example, And obviously with me, it's most part of it. I mean, my best sentences, sometimes tend to be those ones that come out. And you don't need to work with them, when some are just so beautiful, but most of my, the book, they just need rework, and that's why it took 10 years, and so, you're shifting weight between the sentences and between the paragraph, and you're taking words and you put it into another sentence, you're feeding it to another person, there's that kind of relationship that you have with one sentence that is sometimes love and hate. It becomes love and hate, It's like, you're in love with someone and you give them your body, or sometimes you take from them, Do you just submit or you take, or is it a process of give and take? I have no idea. For me, writing is more, I always think it's about the best time, or the best outcome comes when I actually submit myself to the story, So there's that kind of giving, yourself, your body, and I said that to my editor, that the work I do is before writing, and that's where I am aware, to how do I get myself to my desk, through music. I need fragility, I need vulnerability, all those things I work on as a writer. But once I'm at my desk, I have no idea what's happening, and that's, And maybe it's the same for you, right?
100%.
Yeah.
Like I usually start off with an idea.
Yeah.
So literally just a plain idea.
Yeah.
It'll be like
Yeah.
poem from the perspective of,
Yeah.
and I usually write on the top of a piece of paper.
Yeah.
And then I just have that, and then over time I return to them and just kind of like free write. And they're usually big and long and messy. And then it's a process of excision, it's a process of subtraction until you get to the kind of core of it. And then maybe it's a thing of like, now that you've explained, I'm like, oh, maybe there is a process, but like then it becomes a thing of like, how little can I say and still get across what I mean. Like there's a poem in Surge, for example, that I was always really weird about, and the final line is, every year I hear summer ask how autumn can endure winter's undoing. And I spent ages being like, should I say every year or every spring? Because then it's all 4 seasons. But why? You know, like, I don't know. Like, so I went with year, and I still don't know if that was the right decision, you know? But I think you're right. You've got to almost like let the tank fill up and then let it go. And you kind of catch what you kind of...
I love that. Catch what you can.
Yeah.
Oh,
sorry. Oh, we finished?
Yeah.
Oh, damn.
Okay,
we didn't even read anything.
All right.
Should we end with just a couple of poems?
And
Okay.
can we? Right. And that's
I
my
was, like,
poem.
Absorbed.
It's 1 minute.
Shit, is it 7 already?
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, everyone. But yeah, like if you have to go, that's totally fine. But if you can stay for another 5 minutes, yeah, they have to go. That's fine.
So just one thing. You don't need to. No, it's fine. It's no. It's nothing. I actually filmed it today, this morning. I sent to Jay and Anissa because I work a lot around this the 2 pounds of Excel. I'm gonna show to Jay at the weekend, and that's where I do most of my thinking and writing. And so we're talking about responsibility, and for me, I think a lot about this little house, and it's almost like my imagination. That's what I think. It's total. So I just want you to kind of enjoy my imagination. If that makes sense.
Do you often have bells ringing in your...
Not really, but you know what? I thought, okay, shall I take another one? But I thought, no, let's keep it, you know? Because and that's the whole idea is that it's just you. Yes, I sit there and the silence and the trees. I remember William Blake and what he said about the tree and the imagination. You know, it's only for a person of, he says, a man, but a man of imagination, that a tree evokes them to tears, you know? And it's absolutely right, because sometimes I look at a tree, especially when I walk at night, and I feel this intense emotion. And sometimes, like you say, it's almost like you can't catch it, you know? And so, like, I really have, that kind of relationship with nature. And so I just saw all silence. And so I thought, like, to share with you guys.
But you say the sounds, but there's not a second of sound.
Yeah, it's very loud.
But that's at night, that's where I,
Yeah,
you know.
okay, yeah.
But also the birds, you know. I love the birds, but they really active in the morning, you know. Yeah. But the birds, the church just across the thing. It's just because it was at 11, I think, when I Shut it, yeah.
Hey, love your bells here, don't you? It's a lot of
They
bells.
do, right? But you're surrounded by churches, yeah?
All right, I'll
So
read.
you want to read poems, right?
I'll just read a couple just to like round off, and then yeah.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Please.
My voice, it was so weak, so sickened and so grieved. My voice, it was so weak and it broke in the heat. So sickened, so sad, my voice, it was broke. So low was the hope that it sickened, I choked. It closed in my throat. My voice, it was weak, so sickened, so grieved. My voice became glass breaking in heat. I called and no one seemed to call with me, and no one seemed to know or see what I had seen. I was so sickened and so grieved. And I said to the child I knew harboured in the fire, jump Yvonne, jump Paul, jump! And I said to my God I knew harboured in the fire, jump Yvonne, jump Paul, jump! I called, jump Yvonne, jump Paul, jump! My voice, it was so weak, Paul, jump! So sickened and so weak. I heard a sound on New Cross Road that took me back. The first claws of a cuss sprayed from a custom Golf Mark II. 3 Asian boys near the Five Bells pub spoke as if we had grown up side by side, southern cousins taking turns to lick each other with blood clot when someone took a nudie piece, rotted when there was no money this month, au revoir when someone suffered in a way we could enjoy. Like the tea in water, the absent farmer, like pouring bear. South London kids would part suspend their mother tongue, sobbing after someone cussed their mum, and come to sound exactly like my mother, screaming, your ass, at a shocked white face. They don't understand what I'm saying, she said, which is why she said it, knowing they felt every word. They watched us, pursed and spat as we did. Now ginger kids yam dumplings, hijabis snub the man-men. This century dubbed by migrants from the last. We do not speak with one voice about one thing, below the yellow, black, and green flag of England. How many times has Miss D died? How many times has she given us life? How many children does Miss D have? As many as the people hearing this song. Hearing this song, I said they're hearing this song, I said they're listening from beyond. Hearing this song, I said they're hearing this song, I said they're listening from beyond. How many lovers has Miss D had? As many as there are leaves on the trees. How many places has Miss D lived? As many as there are names on the map. Names on the map, is there names on the map? Is there places that you can belong? Names on the map, is there names on the map? Is there places that you can belong? How many times has Miss D died? As often as there have been babies born. How many times will she die once more? As long as things are worth dying for. She came up in the morning, she went down in the evening, she came up with the rising of the sun. And she came up in the morning, she went down in the evening, and when I turned around, she was gone. How many times have you seen her since? Never again, not in the same way. She used to be down in Deptford Market, laughing with the sellers all day. Haggling fish, she's haggling rice, she's good at driving down price. Haggling fish, she's haggling rice, she's good at driving down price. I haven't seen her, nor have you, not since the fire at 439. I heard her daughter was gone 4 days. They wouldn't let her see the remains. And she came up in the morning, and she went down in the evening, and she came up with the rising of the sun. And she came up in the morning, and she went down in the evening. When I turned around, she was gone. 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 Will anybody speak of this the way the flowers do? The way the common speaks of the fearless dying leaves? Will anybody speak of this the way the common does? The way the fearless dying leaves speak of the coming cold? Will anybody speak of this the way the fearless dying leaves speak of the coming cold and the quiet it will bring? Will anybody speak of this, the coming of the cold, the quiet it will bring, the fire we behold? Will anybody speak of this, the quiet it will bring, the fire we beheld, the garlands at the gate? Will anybody speak of this, the fire we beheld, the garlands at the gate, the way the flowers do?